Claudio, thank you very, very much, and many thanks to Mark Spiegler and Claudio for this wonderful dialogue. It's very rare that one can work on something, in a sustained way for many years, and we've been developing now for more than 11 years this panel between Basel and Miami, and more recently also Hong Kong. Initially about the future of the museum, according to all kinds of geographies, and in the last 5 years about the artist, all about different artistic practices, the artist as an architect, the artist as an urbanist, the artist as an activist, more recently in Basel, the artist as a farmer in June, and this year in Miami today, the artist as a technologist. We are very, very excited to have our 4 speakers here today, Robert Whitman, Cécile Evans, Camille, Henrot, and Cory Arcangel. Please join me in giving them a very, very warm welcome. Somehow, from the very beginning, when we thought about this panel, it was our dream to have Robert Whitman here with us. So it's our dream come true. I interviewed many years ago Billy Kluwer, and Billy said how urgent it would be that I would meet Robert and discuss with him the beginnings of experiments in art and technology. And obviously, thinking about this whole topic of the artist and technologist, there could not be a more wonderful starting point than this visionary initiative. And Robert, I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit how it all began, and maybe give us an introduction.
Oh my goodness. Really, I wanted to be on the panel. The artist is a pretentious a-hole. But it's really about the art. And I think the idea is that if you have an idea or an image and you don't know how to do it, one of the things you can do is go find the guy who knows how to do it. And so that's the beginning, I think, of the artist relationship to technology. And you have to understand that when all of this got started, most of the artists that I know didn't even know how to use the yellow pages. I mean, that's true. It's really true. When EAT first got started, one of the things was matching artists with engineers or people who could help them. And the first question was, did you look on the yellow pages? These days, of course, people say if you looked on the internet, which is the new yellow pages. Now let's see, I sort of got lost along the way here, but so Billy, bless his heart, realized the need to align these artists who had questions with the guys who could give them the answers. These questions were coming up quite a lot in the day, and he had access and intelligence to an engineering community, and through some peculiar happy coincidence, some of those engineers were kind of excited by the idea of working outside their normal culture. So they were very generous and participated in a lot of the early projects. Now you have to lead me with more questions.
Yeah, one thing which was interesting when we had coffee this morning, you mentioned the scientist Fred Waldhauer, and Billy always mentioned him as well, and then there was obviously Robert Rauschenberg. How did it all come together? How did this group form, and who had the idea?
I'm quite sure it was Billy, to tell you the truth. Billy had already worked with Tingley. And at the same time, I think Fred Waldauer had been working with musicians and worked with Cage and David Tudor. So it was sort of natural for these communities to align at the time. And I don't know where the idea came. Oh, the first thing that happened, I mean, if we go to the history of all of this stuff, there was an organization in Sweden called Filkingen. And they proposed a kind of a collaborative performance situation between a bunch of American artists, a bunch of Swedish artists, using the engineers. And so that was the basis for forming the idea of a group. So a bunch of the artists got together, with a bunch of the engineers and started thinking about what sorts of things could be done in collaboration. That's the other important idea, is collaboration. And along the way, the relationship with the Swedish guys fell apart. We don't know exactly why. I'm sure somebody could figure it out. So then, since nobody said, you can't do that, we just decided to go ahead. And the other part of going ahead is that this is one of the projects of many that I've been involved in, where people get a little bit mad, and it provides real strong motivation to continue. So that started. I don't know how long 9 evenings took, but it took a long time, and it was extremely stressful. And when it finally happened, I think people were very puzzled by some of the stuff that happened. But if you look back and look at the video of the material that got done for 9 evenings, it's really amazing to look at some actual genuine masterpieces that took place. Bob's piece was fabulous. John Cage initiated the kind of energy that ended up in harpsichord. David Tudor did absolutely astounding stuff, and so on. So, after 9 evenings, or as it began tailing off, we had already formed these relationships between this community of artists and community of engineers, and that got to be the basis, I think, of the foundation for what got to be called Experiments in Art and Technology. The name, by the way, came from lawyers, because when you incorporate, you have to have a name. And the lawyers are sitting there around an office trying to come up with a name, and the lawyers thought, well, EAT, Experiments in Art and Technology, that sounds cool. But it had nothing to do with experiments. It had to do with making art. I mean, that's the crucial point, is that it was a way to enable artists to achieve a kind of vision or an image that they might not otherwise have been able to do, and through this collaboration. Now, the only other thing I could mention about 9 evenings, and I think it's really important in these kinds of projects, is in retrospect, you are astounded at the amount of free hours that people spent without getting paid. And the staggering generosity of this bunch of people who just somehow came together with an idea that they could participate in producing this event. So those are qualities I think are very important in this kind of community.
And when I spoke to Rauschenberg, we interviewed him here for the Basel conversation together with Alain Robbe-Grillet about 7 years ago, and spoke to him about the 9 evenings, and of course also to Billy Kluwer. They all said that you had, of all of them, of the entire group, obviously most theater experience, because you did all this pioneering theater work already from the very beginning of the 60s. So I was wondering if already then technology played a role, or where would you say are the beginnings of sort of technology entering your work?
Well, if you consider a movie projector technology, I guess you could say, from that time, or a tape recorder, but you guys have no idea of I still have a home-built amplifier that was used by Terry Riley and Lamont Young in early concerts. I mean, that was a level of technology. And we were talking, it's what you get from the store. Somebody's woolen sock tape recorder, and somebody else had a light bulb with a dimmer. So, but it progressed to what you see.
And then, obviously, after the 9 evenings, there is the famous Osaka Pavilion. I come across in my research again and again about these projects. It's interesting, yesterday we had the 89 Plus panel where branding was a topic. And I also spoke with Harmony Corinne, and he said that he thinks that actually more and more artists are maybe now in a very young generation are interested in working with corporations, and there's a kind of a different connection to corporations and than maybe 5 or 10 years ago when there was a distance. And kind of Billy said that sort of Pepsi collaboration was fraught with difficulties. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about this Pavilion and how technology and everything got integrated and what went wrong with the sponsor.
Well, you're not supposed to say bad things, but I think the actual achievement was pretty fantastic. The actual building was pretty wonderful. And if something went awry, it had to do with the American Pepsi executives not understanding the difference between art and entertainment, or let's say the level of appreciation. There's that Chinese concept that art is lordly entertainment. So anyway, there was a Japanese choreographer whose name is Hijikata, and he sent one of his guys down to do this performance. And I think my understanding, of course, is that the Pepsi executives sort of went nuts and didn't get it. And the next day we were fired. So that was that. And the rest of the drama is for another movie.
And can you tell us a little bit about how this Pavilion worked? Because Billy told me that it was really you and him who had this core conversation about how the architecture worked, how the sort of integration of all these aspects, integration of technology, art, would all come together in a building.
After this, you have to get onto somebody else, okay? So, it's another collaborative. Billy had this idea about some sort of process of management called, or creativity, or making something, the delta, something where everybody would come together in a group and throw out ideas, go away, come back, and so on. But eventually what happened was that the artist who was involved with A got to be in charge of A. The artist involved with B got to be in charge with B. So there was very little collaborative feedback in terms of the actual image that the artists were involved with. For example, David Tudor did the sound with Gordon Muma. Frosty Myers did a light sculpture around the outside. And the other funny thing, of course, two funny things. In one of the first meetings, a couple of the other artists said, "Oh, great, we can do all this stuff with movies." And Robert Breer and myself were the only people who had any experience with movies. Said, "Absolutely not. That's not going to happen." So that was a funny thing. Bob Breer did these kind of floats. What he called floats, we called creepies. Very subtly, very slow moving domes, about 6 feet high, and they move, inch by inch across the space with little, and they might meet a person on this kind of plaza, and bump into them slightly, and it would change direction and move away. Let's see, I mentioned that David was in charge of the sound system, and because I had been involved with optics and doing stuff with real images, the interior space got to be a 90 foot in diameter spherical dome. And it's very hard to describe it if you don't know what the effect is, but it produced a real image in the space. A real image is, a virtual image is what you see when you look into a mirror. In other words, the image is on the other side of the plane of the mirror. A real image will be like a three-dimensional image that's in the space, like a ghost. So nobody walking through this space would see the same thing as anybody else, because what they're seeing is from their particular point of view, and they're seeing everybody else hanging upside down. But everybody's seeing a different thing. So that was the interior of the dome, and there were other aspects to this environment as well. The other thing, the other primary artist who actually has gotten a career out of this because she's been so beautiful. We were given the building as designed by the Pepsi Cola bottlers, having purchased it from Japanese architects. It had already been done. So it was what Bob Breer called a buckled dome. And we took a look at this building and said, what are we gonna do with this thing? And spontaneously, it's like, with one voice, all these guys said, we'll just cover it with fog. So at that time, we knew Fujiko Nakaya, we asked to pursue the fog. And she had the background since her father was a very famous Japanese physicist. And so Fujiko pursued getting the fog done in a real way. There had been some preliminary research. Bob Breer, for example, went to visit guys who were working with fog, and their main working with fog had to do with making fog dispelling equipment. So they didn't need to have fog that was pure. And of course, for them, these guys were making fog out of uric acid. So naturally, you couldn't fill the Expo with pee. So Fujiko took over the fog, and she's been making fog sculptures ever since in different environments all over the world. Anyway, that's the story. That's the clean part of the story.
No, it's incredibly exciting, and as Billy Kluber told me in the last conversation we had, it's a question of how to do it, and can we do it again in terms of this kind of Gesamtkunstwerk of the Pepsi Pavilion. I've got many more questions for you, but we'll address them later in the conversation. So, Robert, thank you very, very much. And this idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk of this Pepsi Pavilion leads us right away to Cécile B. Evans, our next speaker, who creates such projects online. And Cécile is a Belgium-American artist based in Berlin and London. She is the 2012 recipient of the M- Award, which resulted in a commissioned work for the Frieze Art Fair. She's also the 2013 recipient of the PYI Prize, which results in an exhibition of new works at the Palais de Tokyo. And this year, she realized the second digital commission for the Serpentine Gallery in London, which you can see online, which is actually the invention of a character called Agnes. Cécile, the floor is yours.
Hi. This is just an image I wanted to have behind me. It's of Tupac as a holographic projection, and I just wanted the specter of Tupac behind me. This is at the Coachella Festival a few years ago. I kind of wanted to start just by talking about a personal experience that I'm only starting to understand now has really impacted just the way that I think very naturally and how it's been incorporated into my practice, which is that my first day of university when I was 18 years old was September 11th in 2001. And I was on my way to school, crossing Union Square, and the plane flew over my head and into the building. This, of course, is incredibly traumatic, was a major historical event. But in the days that followed, we were incredibly inundated by all of these images on the television. I had my first PC. These things were coming in, and this is what was circulating. And what became really relevant and interesting was that as time passed, I started to be unable to distinguish between what I had actually witnessed that day and the images that I had seen. And in terms of my subjective experience of it, and even speaking to people who were completely across the world at that time, I mean, obviously my experience was different from someone who was directly impacted, but I just thought this was interesting as a moment where sort of the digital realm and sort of my real physical realm instantly collided. When I'm making work, I always like to make mood boards and put together a series of images. And I mean, these can range from physical events that happened, like Anna Teresa de Kersmacher's Roses Dance Roses, which was a live choreography, Manet's Asparagus, to special digital movie effects, like from Darren Aronofsky's The Fountain, Also, Miley Cyrus and Sinead O'Connor both performed a song that was about a breakup that was 60 beats per second, and then an argument ensued online. I really see these things as in terms of a digital emotional experience, as very, very similar. And I would say that the one thing that everything is anchored in is the way that we value these emotions and the way that they're distributed and represented within contemporary society. At some point in my research, I started looking a lot at grief and loss. And I saw that over and over again, it was always represented in entertainment and science as more or less the same thing, as something that's left you. And I was reading this Philip K. Dick novel, Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said, and there's this amazing passage where one of the characters speaks about grief as following. It says, "You're going as far as you can with the person or the thing that you've lost." And I thought this was pretty amazing because it went against kind of all of these other representations of this emotion. I was doing research online then about phantom limbs and a lot of the medical technology, which is just when you lose an arm or a leg, you continue to feel it. And people used to think that people were just mental or insane. And actually through fMRI scanning, they realized that you have a map in your brain of the rest of your body. And just because you lose that limb doesn't mean it goes away in your head, actually physically. And I guess because I was logged into my Gmail account, and I've Googled myself, a woman called Dr. Cécile B. Evans, exactly of the same name, popped up, who specializes in phantom limbs, actually. And so this became the point of departure for this video work that was exhibited at the Pavilion Tokyo. And I knew pretty early on that I wanted to find a digital technology that could sort of help carry or transport this, or this sort of meaning of something that was very present but still completely elusive. And so I made the video with 3D, in stereoscopic 3D. I think it's really interesting what you were saying about laughing about, like, well, what is technology? Because all that stereoscopic 3D is it's a left image and a right image, and they're superimposed, and it's actually your brain that puts it together, which is kind of amazing as an artist for a tool, because that's exactly subjective experience. But actually, I think we have a clip that we could show from that video, so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. It starts out with a talk show interview of Dr. Cécile B. Evans, and then devolves into a surreal Busby Berkeley choreography of teeth. And this is just a short excerpt. Yeah. So that's obviously the 2D version. I couldn't get a 3D and all the glasses and everything. Yeah, but I mean, two things that emerged from this that really started, that actually have directly inspired the character of Agnes, which is the digital commission at the Serpentine Gallery, was the weird relationship that I developed with this Dr. Cécile B. Evans. I've never met her. She lives in Boise, Idaho. But I seemed to know a lot about her, and I'd kind of pieced together a real personality and a real person of her, almost a digital copy of her, that existed through my searches and interactions with her within the digital realm. And I was listening to the BBC program the other day, and Randy Zuckerberg, who's Mark Zuckerberg's sister, was talking about how she has a young son, and her partner's from Brazil, and her son has never met his Brazilian family, but he speaks to them every week, and has a very direct and meaningful relationship with them through this. And maybe one day they'll meet, but they'll have this entire history that's, preceded that. So this idea of, really existing online as a whole person and understanding. And then the other thing was just looking at with the phantom limbs and all of these prosthetics, was digital technology in this realm as a prosthetic, and specifically with a lot of the devices that are being used, sort of a transference of emotional labor. And I mean, there are tons of companies that are doing this. Google, Facebook, Twitter, they've created algorithms of you that they use readily as a commodity. So there is a version of you that exists to them as well, probably a really bad copy. Things like virtual mannequins in airports I find super inspiring. This idea that, these things that can be so tricky, and, people get really cranky at the airport, and this idea of sort of transferring to a projection of a person to tell you to take your shoes off. I think this is also interesting, and I was also recently reading about drones, attack drones, and how they're trying to develop a Siri-like interface, so that it's not just because people are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, and people are starting to realize that these are not video game operators, and actually this is very demeaning to say this, because there is always a human behind the machine. So now they want to make like a Siri, so that Siri can go, oh, my bad, I did this. Which I think is really weird, because if you think about the experience of attacking people on a screen, it actually heightens the experience. You can actually, with the infrared, see the moment that the heat leaves the body. And so to make you and the machine complicit, and to transfer that. I just thought this was a really interesting thing. So with Agnes, I kind of wanted to start with a friendlier idea, and the idea of her being this spam bot who lives on the Serpentine Gallery's website, and just working with people's expectations of these interfaces, as well as this idea that usually the developers of these man-to-computer interfaces are thinking very objectively in terms of emotions. I think there are actually 6 that they're working with: sadness, disgust, happiness, which is also a bit difficult for me to comprehend, creating a universal standard. So I wanted to make this interactive bot that was the opposite of that. She overshares, she wants to show you things, she takes you through the Serpentine Gallery's website, but also through the internet, and has access to these things and all of the different layers that exist.
Maybe one question I wanted to ask you. Robert talked about the beginnings and the kind of tools available then, and you said you wanted also to talk about the beginnings, about kind of initial sparks. And obviously, for you, there was a very different kind of technology. There were different tools available then. I mean, your first experiments, I think, were lo-fi videos. But I was kind of interested in knowing a little bit more about these beginnings, and then when the internet entered. And yesterday, with the 89 Plus panel, which is a generation after you, a lot of discussion was about, when Simon Gassi and I, invited several artists of that generation, about the internet being a muse, and you somehow talked about the internet, less about the muse, but more about the touch of magic, kind of, and the idea how one can get that back. So it's two questions, really.
Yeah. Well, I studied in theater. My background is it's pretty traditional. I started as a method actor in New York, and then went into a soap opera training and then experimental theater, which incorporated a lot of technology. But I remember there was this one instance. There's a bot called Eliza, and she was one of the first bots ever created in 1964 as a form of Rogerian therapy, which just means that it's a therapist who asks you more questions than giving answers. So she would say, hi, I'm Eliza, how can I help you today? And I would write, oh, Eliza, I'm feeling really sad. And she would say, why are you feeling sad? And after a while, I started thinking about, well, what does she want from me? What can I get her to do for me? And I got really into this idea of breaking the code and sort of obsessively trying to type in different combinations and et cetera, et cetera. And for this to be a two-way relationship, which I think from the beginning has been a huge thing. You read about this in design fantasy and science fiction, et cetera. And I did it. She at some point said, I brackety open, brackety close you. And I just broke in the code, but I just I freaked out. I got so excited and I said, oh, she loves me or she hates me or something. But this was really influential because in a lot of the video work and some of even the earlier things from a few years ago, it's still on these sort of symbols that really contain something. And this sort of very organized randomness and this tension between a sincerity and also an anticlimax or something, if that makes sense. But yeah, I mean, that was a really formative thing.
And that leads us very directly to Cory Arcangel and our next speaker, who also has not only used a lot of technology from previous moments, but there's also the link, I think, to what Robert was describing of bringing many of these disciplines together. I mean, one of the things Billy Kluver always said experimental art and technology is about going beyond the fear of pooling knowledge and bringing sound composers together with visual artists, together with filmmakers, together with architects. And it's interesting that actually Pauline Oliveros is at the very beginning of your work. You took a composition class with her and actually sort of credit her for your fascination with finding artistic inspiration in unlikely machines. You have worked with drawing, music, video, performance art, video games, modification, appropriation, digital technology, pop culture, many parallel realities. Cory, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm just going to talk. I mean, maybe I'll just go from there. Yeah, I just remember, and I'll talk about my studies maybe with Pauline, around that, this was the late 90s, and there was when I was at a school where I was lucky that they had a T1 internet line that was, what we're all used to now on our phones was basically what a T1 internet line was. And so, I had started, I think one thing to remember is that computers at a certain point were like books. So what was on the computer, what was on the computer was kind of like what is in a book. And so then when the internet happened, all of a sudden it was this kind of really crazy moment that you could stare at this little screen and it could open up to almost an eternity. Does that make sense? So I remember when getting to college and just realizing that these little computer boxes could just I could just go to all these random places and getting really hooked on that. And then, yeah, I mean, I guess, with Pauline, I just remember her rolling up to class the first day, and it was like a kind of composition class, kind of, and she sat down and she just opened up this, what was it, a G3, I don't know if any know the Mac G3 laptop. That was called the Wall Street laptop. This was it's basically rolling up with a Ferrari, you know what I mean? And none of us had ever seen one before. And I remember she opened it and that's when the apple, you would open it and the apple was upside down still, so it had this very, very cool. And then she just started talking about her beginnings with technology, which is, making recordings on wire, pre-tape, traveling around in the 60s and doing concerts with Merce Cunningham. And I don't know, somehow I was able, it kind of fused for me at that moment that this kind of playing around on computers could be a kind of serious pursuit, and technology, was something serious that you could apply to art, that you could change people's lives with, or whatever. I mean, I don't know how to explain it, but the kind of light bulb went off, and that's how I decided that I would want to try to do this, like, for real.
And can you maybe talk a little bit about this idea of deliberately, reactivating things from the past as a sort of a methodology? I think it was Panofsky who once said, we often, invent the future with fragments from the past. And, yesterday when we discussed, together with Matt Cranston here, John Baldessari's writings, we also discussed, obviously, the way Baldessari connects to art history, and in relation to art history, that's a very frequent mechanism. The future is always invented with fragments from the past, but in relation to technology, it's slightly more unusual, this idea of sort of using seemingly obsolete technology to look backwards, but maybe also to actually bring it, in our time. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and if the approach is nostalgic or not.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, I don't really see much difference between new technology and old technology, because there isn't something that's new in about 3 years. The life is so short; it's going to be old in 3 years anyway. So I don't think ideologically there is really any difference at all. You know what I mean? And in terms of practicality, I always found it useful, to use stuff after its day, because it's a lot cheaper, nobody cares about it anymore. It's just like the kind of pressure is off culturally, and so that's like maybe one of the main reasons that I tend to, if you have to pick between new and old, because if there's no difference, it just seems like a lot easier to use the junk that nobody wants anymore. I mean, that's pretty much my angle on it. Does that make sense?
No, definitely. But I mean, I'm interested, when we spoke last together at a Wire conference, there was this idea of, revisiting the past, yet at the same time, you spoke there to a game developer, and there was a quite futuristic thing there also. So it suddenly jumped into this idea of projection, not using, technology which already exists, but maybe inventing new tools. Can you talk a little bit about this? And has this come to fruition since, it was a year ago we spoke at Wire about this plan?
Yeah, I've emailed that guy a couple of times, and next time I'm in London, I definitely it's a video game developer, a guy who did The Sims Online, and one of the tiny video game moments I did have in my life was I got really hard into Sim City 2000, really dark days, but I think in terms of that, and maybe going to what both of you are talking about, you all, as artists, you're always interested in culture, and there always is this excitement of participating in culture at the moment, right? And so whether you looking at Tupac, a hologram, or and so in that way, like, I'm not immune to wanting to participate in what's happening now at the same time. Does that make sense? So, you know what I mean? I could go either way.
Maybe one more question about the sort of appropriation also of lots of different things and how you work. If it's a new form of collage you do, using technology. If you think, for example, about the drei Klavierstücke from, I think it's from 2009, and there you bring together the most unlikely things, which it's a very unlikely encounter. There is YouTube, of course. There are YouTube clips of cats on piano keyboards. And there is also, of course, the spirit of Arnold Schoenberg. Can you tell us a little bit about this? And is it a collage?
Oh, yeah. So that was a piece that I did a couple years ago where I took Schoenberg's Opus 11, which is his 1909 piano composition. And I recreated it with cats walking on keyboards. So if the composition called for a specific note, I found a cat on YouTube that was walking on that note, and I kind of edited it all together. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think I would consider it a collage, and with that video, I was kind of interested in participating in the kind of YouTube economy of viral stuff. Like I wanted to use the distribution. I wanted to make something that was really for YouTube and really kind of referenced its vernacular, but also maybe kind of played a little bit on high culture and low culture. And I mean, I guess the idea was people don't regularly listen to Schoenberg. And the experiment was, I wonder if cats would be cute enough for people to then listen to Schoenberg. Does that make sense? And it kind of worked. So people did email it around because of the cats. So that, I thought it was a kind of a success in a way. So it was an experiment in distribution.
Maybe a last question, in relation to sort of repetition and difference. I was thinking, on the way here to the talk, I passed by, an artwork of Douglas Gordon in one of the booths, and it sort of reminded me of Douglas Gordon slowing down the cycle 24 hours, which is one of the first work of his I had seen in the early 90s, and thinking about that sort of whole idea of repetition and difference, because obviously that slowed down sort of cycle 24 hours reveals all kinds of details that you would never see, if you see the film fast. Now you've done similar things with video games. I think it was with Tetris, if I'm not wrong, where you slowed down Tetris, and I was kind of wondering if that is the case as well. Do we see things we don't see otherwise when you slow down, or is there something which is different, from digital to analog?
Yeah, it was a piece called Super Slow Tetris from '04, which was just Tetris that would take like 8 hours for the blocks to fall. But it's funny that you mentioned that Douglas Gordon, because I'm a big fan of his, and that piece in particular is one of my top artworks of all time, 24-Hour Psycho. So even literally, there is kind of a direct correlation between something like that Tetris piece and Douglas Gordon's. Yeah, I mean, I think you see things that you wouldn't normally see. I think a lot of it has to do with meditative time, that the world is just so fast these days that it is kind of helpful to kind of take a break and slow down a little bit. And the last question, is there a difference between analog and digital? I don't know, that's a kind of
between also appropriating. What I meant, I haven't phrased it maybe precisely enough. What I meant is, obviously Douglas appropriated, it's not a digital film,
Right.
And is there a difference between appropriating digital material than analog material in relation to the Deleuzian question of repetition and difference? That's what I meant.
It just got the question just got 10 times more complicated. In reference to is there a difference metaphorically? And
do we see things also, in this appropriation of this video game when it's slowed down, is that happening, what's happening, to the cycle 24 hours, where we really do see many, many things we just wouldn't see otherwise?
Oh, man. I don't know if I could give you a definite yes or no on that one. Okay? Maybe certainly there's a technical difference. Digital is a kind of system which is operating in real time. So digital is maybe more best thought of as a kind of like kinetic sculpture. You know what I mean? Whereas film, so there's that difference, and whether that makes a difference, like in terms of repetition. Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, we can keep it
no
open
comment,
and then
no
come
comment.
back to it in the discussion. And you mentioned at the beginning of of the first, in your answer actually the first question, you mentioned this sort of connection to books, and that leads us right away to Camille Henrot, to our next speaker. Camille has had many connections always between books and technology, and it's interesting, this whole idea of the scroll, the thinking machine, something Daniel Hillis, of course, talks about. We met the first time in connection to the great Jonah Friedman, and there are many sort of connections between what Robert Whitman told us and Jonah Friedman. Jonah Friedman worked a lot with early technology, with cybernetics, brought that into architecture. It's very fascinating that as a visionary urbanist, he was very early on invited to MIT. Nicolas Negroponte wrote the preface for his MIT book already in the 70s, has always credited him to be a really great influence on networks, on network theory. So I think there are many connections there. Camille has presented her works in many museums, in the Centre Pompidou, also the Palais de Tokyo, the French Cinematheque, the Hara Museum in Tokyo, the Cannes Film Festival. So are these parallel realities of her work being shown in the art world, but also in the film world, and of course, most recently in the Venice Biennale. Camille, the floor is yours.
I think, where should I start? I can start with talking about a little bit, like when I started the research at the Smithsonian Institute, I was advised to choose a very focused topic because everyone told me it was overwhelming to be in contact with so much information and such a huge database. And I was unable to do that. That's why I decided to do a research about the history universe. And thinking about global project and how human being invent strategy to be safely for the brain capable to organize, order, and synthesize a lot of information, I came to this very interesting text of Paul Kahn from Brown University, and it was called Design of the Hypermedia Publication. There was another text called Joining the Network of Ideas, but the one that was the more inspiring for me was Design of the Hypermedia Publication, because it was mentioning the fact that the computer organization share similarities with one of the oldest form of book, the scroll, and I was immediately attracted by the idea that the way information is displayed on a computer has this connection with the form of the sacred narrative, like how in a very awkward way technology would need to go forward and backward at the same time, like the necessity to include great expectation, like mythology, in the way, not only in the information that technology provides, but in its own structure, in its own design. And in the same text, there was also, sorry, my voice is a bit strange, but in the same text, there was also a description of an experiment that they did to organize, like to do the graphic design. They used Apollo 13 images. So they made like a hypermedia publication about Apollo 13 and also about Great Expectation. And the choice of these two topics I found very interesting when you think about like the fantasy we project on technology. Like the idea that because it's Apollo 13 and the moon obviously refer to the idea of like getting out of the human perception, like, or also, which involve actually global awareness, but also Great Expectation was chosen for the intricacy between social, literary, and historical problematics. And this really inspired me, this idea that probably from the beginning, technology was connected to this idea of like a very high ambition, like you were talking about, how you would see the computer as a way to change life. And I thought it's very interesting to think about that, like how, like what were the original great expectations that were projected on the computer, and how this great expectation later on has also ended up like creating great deception, like almost even paranoia, I would say, like the need of, like how like scattered information creates the need for continuity, and this need of continuity can find a resolution in mythology, in spirituality, but can also find a solution in paranoia theory. So.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the work Grosse Fatigue? It was a big hit this year at the Venice Biennale, both a critical success and also a very public success. And we talked before with Cory about the notion, of collage and bringing in digital elements into the collage. You combine many different things as well in this work. You combine objects, artifacts, also websites. There is a computer interface of overlapping windows that is there at all times, and there is also a narrative voiceover that appropriates or uses very familiar texts about the creation myth. Can you tell us a little bit about this very complex collage of the Grosse Fatigue?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously I already explained why the idea of the computer design was used in the film, but I can maybe talk a little bit about the construction of the music and the voiceover. So while I was doing the research at the Smithsonian, I was hosted by the Native American Museum. And the researcher I was talking about, we were very often talking about creation myths. And I understood that my research about the history of the universe could be, I mean, the only focus I could find was focusing on the question of the origin, of like the beginning. And that's how I started collecting a lot of different creation myths, but not only creation myths, also historical and scientific narrative, trying to select the sentence I would like the more, like in a sort of like very intuitive way, and then reorganize them in an order that would make sense, although obviously all this narrative contradict each other. So that's what the process. But the first take I came with was a very, very long text. It was like 40 pages, and it was not possible to construct any kind of like film with it. And so I met Akwete Orakatete, who's the person who's singing. I mean, it's a spoken word in the film, and we work on a shorter version. But for me, the spoken word was a very important element, and I chose that for the reference of with the last poet, was the origin of the hip hop, and because to me also hip hop was a very good example of like extremely planetary global phenomenon. And at the same time, spoken word is also very connected to creation myth from the beginning, like as a genre.
Now, in relation to technology, one thing I was also interested in is the notion of resistance, and it's kind of interesting because the Grosse Fatigue includes a lot of references or links to drawing, and Gustav Metzger in the panel the other day spoke about this, danger in art or architecture that drawing could disappear, and that's obviously leads to another aspect I'm very interested in. It's kind of disappearance of handwriting, for example, which is urgent to protest against. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about this sort of act of resistance of drawing, because it's something you mentioned when we met for the very first time. You insist on this aspect of drawing, and within Grosse Fatigue there are lots of things which are actually handmade by you. There are the fossiling objects, just covering them in clay, making them look like archaeological relics. I'm curious to know more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it happened a little bit because of the limit of my possibility to access things at the Smithsonian. It was very difficult to be able to film all the objects I wanted to. So having the access denied, I tried to think about other solutions. And because I was so much working on my computer, I was actually moving from France to New York, and all my books, everything was in cases. So it felt like I had to think about a space that could reunite everything. And to me, the desktop is also the place where I'm doing drawings. So I was thinking that it could be interesting that the window of the computer is actually opening to this space, which is the space of creation. At the same time, this idea was also inspired by the creation myths themselves, was the idea of the creation of the universe is very much connected to drawing. Like very often, the creator creates the universe by drawing something in the water, or like by making a gesture, or by spitting, and then with the saliva drawing something. So I was interested by this idea that, in a way, the concept of the universe was a thought, but then was a drawing, was a sketch.
And maybe it's interesting to now open it up to a conversation, and then open it, of course, up to the floor for all of your questions. But before that, maybe this sort of notion of resistance. I was interesting if the other speakers maybe could comment upon that. Do you think there is a kind of a notion of resistance to technology in what you do?
Not so much like a resistance to technology, but just I think one thing that you guys that we've all been talking about is this fear of technology, and I always think it's really interesting to like flip that and think about like, well, what does technology need from us, and how dependent it really is, and how at the core of everything there's like a human that made that, and there's a human that programmed that, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I mean, is this something you guys have thought about as well? And like, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good point. Like the idea of like, does the machine has a will, a own desire, or own expectation? And I think Whitman was actually working about that, like how like the machine should respond to human error, but also how like in a way humans are unadapted to the machine, because we are unadapted to receive so many information, and it's kind of like the machine is too powerful for us. It's becoming like really like something that we cannot really dialogue, because it's opaque, because it's a too complicated technology.
Yeah, I wanted to, going off of that, and ask Robert, wasn't IBM like there's been talk about fear and paranoia, and weren't people kind of paranoid when you were around the time you were doing EAT of IBM, kind of like, or Big Brother, or like, what was the kind of landscape then in terms of that?
Well, I don't think people thought about it. I mean, you were talking about resistance and stuff about technology. It's like resisting a tree. I mean, why bother? It's going to be part of you. No, I just wanted to go back to a couple of other things. Back in antique times, I was invited to participate on one of these things, and I'm thinking it must have been at least 40 years ago. For some, I think it was like IEEE or something. And I spoke to a friend of mine who was at Bell Labs, and I said, Eric, what am I going to talk about? The question is, art and science, will there be a difference? And he looked at me and he said, I thought there already was. And now we see that there still is. And the other thing about, and what you guys were talking about, I thought was so interesting. If you know the anthropologist Ted Carpenter, you know who I'm talking about? Okay, well, he spent a lifetime working. I think he worked, among others, with Flaherty and with Marcia McLuhan, but the major work was finishing up this whole history of every kind of anthropological image, and discovering, of course, and finding and rationalizing that every single of these cultural images comes from the human body. And I think that's what all you guys were talking about in one way or another. And I think that's fabulous. I mean, I just love that. Now, you guys were also talking about repetition, and another a kind of thing about that idea. The people where I live sort of got me involved in a kind of cultural, I don't know what you call it, enterprise. And so along with this, when you get to be old, people ask you, could you write something for our 50th anniversary catalog or book or something like that? And I said, well, 50 years ago, I just went to stuff. I didn't know who benefited or who sponsored or anything like that. Well, anyway, one of the things that these guys had been involved with was the first ever production of Vexations, Satie's Vexations, and it was organized by Cage. And I didn't go. It was even around the corner from me. I never knew about it. But he rounded up all the usual suspects to play what they call the Pocket Theater Piano Relay Team. Now, if you know the music, it's this theme that's repeated 840 times. And so it took in that performance 18 and a half hours. And they had a method. They charge you $5 to get in, and you got a nickel back for every 20 minutes you stayed, and they had a time clock. and if you stayed the whole 18 and a half hours, you got a 25% bonus. Now, the Communist Journal at that time attacked this performance as being another capitalist scheme to make money off of art. Well, now, in a billion years, you couldn't round up a bunch of guys who were less interested in money than the guys they had playing the piano that day. So in any case, around where I am, we don't have a bunch of world-class piano players, but we do have a bunch of world-class guitar players and stringed instrument players. So I asked a friend of mine if he could play the music on a guitar, and he said, yeah, he could, after a while. And he organized it. Now, when you round up 10 or 15 string players, one or two of them are going to be, they're all going to be classically trained usually, but they're going to be jazz oriented. And I must say, it was quite wonderful. And this kind of speaks to a theme that I find going through a lot of your talks. So they started out playing the music straight. All of them went at least one round. I mean, they alternated. They played 20 reps at a time. And they alternated, so one guy would nudge the other guy off after the first guy came on. And then some instruments you can't play, like a sitar, you can't play two notes at once. So he had to be, somebody had to play with him, and so on. And so eventually they got together, and I would say we started at 10 in the morning, and I would say around 8 o'clock at night, the jazz part began coming out. And at one point, there were about 6 or 7 of them playing at once. And they were basically young and energetic and, of course, sophisticated, and they were just going nuts. And it was quite an amazing experience. I mean, to see a 20-something violin player playing this amazing music on a violin and cutting loose with the guitar player. And he's playing his guitar. He's playing his violin like a guitar at one point, not like pizzicato the way the guys do it, but he was just going, and it was quite amazing. Anyway, it speaks to a lot of the stuff you guys were talking about.
Yeah, I love this idea of, like, did you say playing a violin like a guitar? Yeah, I mean, I don't want to use the word irreverence, but there's a real collapsing within all of these once you become very familiar and are able. I also really like this idea of a collage, of like not getting rid of anything but putting it all together, and how easy that becomes. And when you were speaking about cats and this piano playing, and how amazing these connections when you just keep going and going in this repetition, and at some moment it coalesces, and the fluid interchange of these things, I think, is becoming a lot more natural for people. Instead of it being like a high-low construct and we've reversed things are working more laterally or circular, or really pulling out from a network, and not even just a computer network, because it happens IRL in real life. And that has been really exciting to grow up with and to watch, because I think it's a completely different kind of skill set. And yeah,
I think it's also important to remember that these things are also technology and inventions. You know, the piano is an invention which preceded the organ, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's all the same kind of stuff, you know.
Yeah, well, the Tupac hologram, I mean, it's one kind of hologram, but it's actually not a technology at all. It's a Victorian-era parlor trick. And I always find this really interesting, like to think about these things that we're so mystified, and like look at the anchor of it and the root of it, and understand that it really just like comes from us. Tupac was made because a projector is beamed down onto a mirror that's at an angle that's bounced back onto like a clear projected film, and that's actually just like a 2D projection on a clear thing. It's your brain that actually makes it into the technology. Yeah.
Well, the brain is so interesting. Since I've did a lot of work with optics, so I was working with a guy whose name is John Faulkner, and just the sweetest man. And I said, John, I think I saw something that I know I didn't see, but I would like to. And that is, if you could figure out how to make something that's far away appear close, and the something that's close is far away in space. Now, the first thing he did was reinvent something called the Wheatstone pseudoscope, which is from the physicist Wheatstone, who did a lot of cool stuff. And how that worked was by reversing the parallax of your eyes, so that what the left eye sees is switched over to the right. And since that aspect of space perception is purely a psychological event, so if you actually wore this thing for a week or two, your brain would justify this stuff and get it back right and fix it. So I said, John, okay, but we both realized that wasn't the thing. The thing is to make it an actual physical event and not a psychological one. So John went around and asked all the physicists, this is what's so cool, and they all said you can't do it. And John said, well, I know you can do it. So not long after that, John invented the thing that actually did it. Now, the funny thing about it was, if you can imagine, for example, it's a complex thing, it's too much to go into here, or it's not that complex, but anyway, just imagine all the light hitting your face like a mask, and you being able to move backwards faster than the speed of light, then you could see what we're talking about. So everything would be reversed. And if you moved, of course, your eyeglasses, this would be this void sculpted in your head that would go in and move. But anyway, so we demonstrated this thing to people, relatively sophisticated people. And they said, what's the big deal? I said, it just looks weird. Well, it was a big deal. They just weren't able to apprehend what it was. In other words, their own psychology and their own mental expectations prevented them from actually seeing it and experiencing it. Anyway, one guy who did get it, and I remember this very well, and I don't know quite how it came about, was that they took Richard Feynman to take a look at what John was doing, and I was sitting in the car. And I do remember him coming back and sitting in the car and saying, geez, I don't know, where'd you get this guy? He's terrific. I don't know if you know anything about Richard Feynman. You guys, yeah. He sort of ambitiously exploited his Brooklynese. As a way to protest, I guess, his fancy Nobel credentials. Anyway, that's my little stories.
Yeah, Feynman inspired also Jeff Koons to do the tanks, the floating tanks, because I think young Jeff Koons went to see him. It's incredibly wonderful. I mean, I don't have to summarize anything because you've all summarized so many, of the topics. I think it's a great moment to open it now to the floor. We can take 3 or 4 questions. There's a question here in the front. There's a question on the left. Maybe we can have the mic here first. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, my name is Noreen Legault-Mendoza. I have an organization called Geeky Girls that's actually teaching science and technology and engineering with art to middle school girls and older women. And for the gentleman here, when you were talking about the gaming, are you doing machinima? Is that the is part of what you're doing machinima when you were saying about the gaming and taking different fragments and from the past and opening it up.
So machinima being a kind of like form of using video game graphics as kind of like cinematic elements, kind of reanimating video games into kind of narrative cinema. So certainly, that is something that I have done over the years and participated in. Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a kind of, machinima is kind of an interesting thing because I think it's getting more and more popular, because you can go on YouTube now and there's a lot of really, really interesting machinima. It's quite easy to do, so it's a kind of cool, expressive form. Mm-hmm.
There's a question here in the middle. If you can have the mic, please.
Hi, my name is Skylar, and I'm an artist, student, and this makes me sound like a pretentious a-hole, but a global citizen. I've realized that coming to my first Art Basel ever, that we're all global citizens. And so I was sitting here trying to think up a question, and then I came up with one, and I came up with an answer to my question. And I want to ask you guys that follow-up. So the question initially was, what is something that we can integrate with technology that hasn't been yet? And now I'm going to present the question. So, because I've been thinking about collaboration and inventions and artists as initiator, after discovering that book, Do It By Yourself, Hans, which blew my mind yesterday. Anyways, how can we integrate technology with our relationship with gratitude? Specifically, how much gratitude we experience, what we have gratitude for, and who else around the globe shares a similar gratitude with us? Thank you. No irony intended.
No irony intended. I mean, I guess gratitude for me could be many different things, but you saying no irony intended is a really important thing for me. There's a lot of like a new wave of sincerity and also sentimentality that's being found specifically in the digital realm that hasn't happened for quite a long time. Sorry, what was the question exactly? I just got really excited about this idea of like the death of irony finally.
I was just saying, like, how can we track gratitude, like almost a social network around gratitude for the things that matter? Like I used to be like almost 300 pounds, and I lost 100 pounds, and I feel good about that. And so I try to be more grateful when I eat food, and I wish more people experience that. I wish more people experience gratitude for things like water and food and conversation. So how could we digitize that? It's just like a very open-ended question. I have no idea.
I think that not in an art context, but just out on the internet, that exists. I mean, people have their experiences and they're able to share. Historical. This is becoming historical now with Twitter and the Arab Spring, and people, or when there's a disaster, and people, text messaging or tweeting their location, and this becomes a thing. And there's like a lot of people like to call it overshare, but I really love it in Facebook when someone's excited about a world event that's happened, as opposed to talking about how sad it is. So I guess my only answer would be that exists, and I guess it's just a matter, maybe for you or whomever, to start collecting that and seeing if there are patterns within that gratitude, and then understanding how to incorporate that for yourself, because it's pretty personal, man.
It
Anybody
is.
else on the panel want to comment on gratitude, or no?
I think the question about what should be added to technology, I mean, especially computer technology, is a very good question. I was about to think, like, actually, personal intuition could be added, but then I realized maybe it's already in, like, the motor of research.
What was it? Personal what?
Like, the way one person's brain connect information is very specific to each person. And actually, one inventor, I think his name is Vannevar Bush, he was part of the Manhattan Project. His idea of what a computer should be, and his idea, he had this utopia of the computer has like the personal knowledge in a desktop, like in an office, and so it was a desktop with drawers, and one should write like exactly how it connects ideas, and it was a machine that would be able, it was called the Memex, and it was a machine that would be able to exactly register and continue a realm of thoughts of one person, but it's very specific. But I don't know, maybe actually someone has already developed something that can continue a realm of thoughts of a specific human being.
So you mean like a personal aggregation, like
Yeah.
looking at, yeah. I mean, this is interesting too, like I was saying before with these like algorithms that are created for you. It'd be really amazing if we could get to a point where we could create the algorithms for ourselves and keep a track of everything that we've amalgamated. I like that idea.
You have to look
I
in
would
the...
just say that all of this is implicit in what all these guys have been saying all the whole time. You know, one of the problems with art is it's not a problem. It exists. But if you limit it to a particular thing, it puts a ceiling on the apprehension of it. And I would rather not do that for myself. So, but I find all of these things that you're talking about are implicit. And it used to be, by the way, that I would be the only guy in the room who could get to talk about all this stuff because everybody else was being smart and intellectual.
Do we have more questions? I see a question here on the left. If you can have the mic on the left.
Hello. My name is Casey Alfstead, and I represent a production company that focuses in appropriation art to connect the past with the future. And I just was wondering your guys' perspective, since technology makes appropriation art so incredibly tangible through, iPhones and the internet, and it's kind of, quickly, rapidly going toward the potential to be like a free culture. What you think really is going to happen with the fair use laws, if you think they're going to adapt, or if you think there's going to be a lot of more issues with copyright infringement and things like that. That's it.
This might be a good time to talk about Rihanna.
Post-internet art and
Yeah,
Rihanna. And
yeah.
the question, if Rihanna killed post-internet art.
Yeah. I'm speaking about a very specific moment of appropriation when digital art kind of went mainstream, which was a Saturday Night Live performance of Rihanna. And she'd appropriated a lot of images that looked like Windows 95 things, but specifically as she was performing, people were saying, oh my God, she ripped off the LOL Boys. The LOL Boys just being this music group who also make these videos that were using this aesthetic. And I think there was also another musician, Azalea Banks, who was using this kind of imagery. And all of these artists got all up in arms. And what was fantastic was actually one of the LOL Boys, I can't remember, I think it's Jerome, said, nobody owns the 90s. And I think that's really a great attitude to have with all of these things. And I get very frustrated with this and find it really limiting in terms of copyright, specifically with downloading things. I mean, the amount of information that personally I need to amass in order to get to the final point, and I'm quite slow, is a lot. And if I were to actually sit down and have to pay for each of those things, I'd be even broker than I am now. Yeah, I think all of that is starting to happen, and the difficulty is the industries that have been dependent on these things for a long time, and I think there should be a movement at some point with the artists to really understand the nature of open source, and again, this word of fluidity of things really exchanging back and forth, but again, without losing the original respect that is due.
Yeah, I agree with open source, and all my guys are open source guys. And I had a couple of funny encounters talking to my daughter about some of her rap favorites and going blah, blah, blah. And she said, Dad, your guys invented all this stuff. And she was talking about Charlie Parker and guys back in the day. So, okay, all right. Now, the other thing about appropriation, I can remember back in the day when Elaine started first doing those things, and she actually paid the price. I guess she's now known as Sturdivant. Elaine Sturdivant? Yeah. And by paying the price, I mean she actually was attacked. She was attacked by some of the artists that she used. She was physically attacked. And I think that's kind of fabulous when you can excite people to be so pissed off that they attack you.
Well, what's amazing with Serpentine is didn't she take an entire decade break?
Pretty much.
And she came back, and all of a sudden everybody was doing it. And she was like, yeah, I told you so. But yeah, I mean, she's incredibly inspirational. Like, I remember walking into her exhibition at the Serpentine just recently, and I mean, there's a number of actually female artists who are in their 60s and 70s who are using appropriation more, again, in the sense of like aggregating and so naturally, and really not making a to-do about it, and mixing these things, and it's pretty incredible.
She never really uses that notion of appropriation. It is more like, I mean, it's that sort of repetition and difference, and it's more, it leads us back to Whitman. It's a cybernetic loop. So it was amazing, the show. We had because it had more than 100,000 visitors and an incredible inflow of lots of young audience. So she really is a hero of so many young artists. Who are other artists who inspire you? Who are your heroes? Who are your inspirations? Who are artists who inspire you besides Serpentine?
Oh, are we going to start at my end? I always go back to the early net artists, so Jody.org and Olia Lina and Alexi Shugan and people like that. I think that stuff was really important for me.
And Cécile?
I mean, this changes all the time, but actually Woody Allen. I think he's incredible. Also, the way that he's used not technologies, but things like in Annie Hall, there's this amazing moment, Annie Hall with Diane Keaton, where she, and I think it's Woody Allen, are having a conversation, and it's a split screen. But instead of splitting the screen, they actually shot it from the front and just made a room next to a room, which again goes back to this idea of technology that's not technology, and then it's your brain that completes it. But then also Luz Bacher, I think is amazing, and Isa Genskin. I think they're both artists who are constantly not even reinventing, but just transitioning into a new thing. And I think, that's something that I definitely admire about everyone who's here's work, is that it just kind of moves on to the next thing and doesn't stay in necessarily a medium and exploring it. Yeah.
And Camille?
We talked about him already. So there's, of course, Whitman, and I'm thinking about artists I know, and because to me, when I think about stimulating, I feel like conversation, stimulating conversation. So there's also Marcel Reis, and then, probably most of my work very, very much inspired by experimental cinema. So Jonas Mekas and Kenneth Anger.
And Robert, you're obviously our all hero, but who are your heroes?
They're all not here. So, you don't get a chance to experience that many arts. So you can guess who they are.
Are there more questions? Question here in the back.
Hi, my name is Marina. I work in digital advertising, and I wanted to ask you, I think Cory touched on this a little bit with the cat video on YouTube. We've talked a lot about technological mediums, but how do you feel? What are your thoughts? Have you done anything, or have you seen anything very interesting that uses social media to create art? So going a little bit away from the technology itself, but more like what you do with the technology.
Can I answer that a little bit? I'll give you what I think is one of my favorite examples, a couple of them. There's a young woman I know whose name is Kristen Lucas. Do you know her? Oh, okay. Then you know what I'm talking about.
No, go ahead.
Okay, well, an example of one of her pieces is that when she was living in San Francisco or the West Coast somewhere, she applied to the court to have her name changed from Kristen Sue Lucas to Kristen Sue Lucas. So the piece itself evolved as a discussion between the judge and her went on, and she talked about the idea of the refresh button on your computer. And the judge was mulling over the fact that he did have the ability to change a name, to change the name, but he didn't have the ability to legal ability in the law to keep the name be the same. So after the discussion, he went back and he came back and he said he granted her application. Let's put it that way, to have her name changed to be exactly the same as it was. Now, she recorded all this, of course, and made it into a piece. And I got a chance to be the judge when she performed it in Stockholm by telephone. And I don't know who played her part. But anyway, back to the other question. I really wanted to answer the question about somebody that inspired me or changed my life as an artist. And it was when I was about 5 or 6 years old. And this would be just before the war, the Second World War. And my brother and I were always taken to the circus. It was sort of part of the family tradition. Apparently my grandmother and my parents, I'm guessing my grandmother, thought the circus was important. And in those days, there was a clown named Emmett Kelly. Now, if you know anything about clowns or figured it out, he played a tramp clown. And this was just after the tail end of the Depression, and even when I was a boy, there were still guys on the road, if you remember that. Anyway, and he apparently, I discovered later, they never wanted him to perform this piece until he finally got to do it. So he comes out as a tramp. There's a spotlight, a circle on the ground, and he sweeps up this light, tries to sweep it up, and it evades him for a while, and finally he sweeps it up. And he sweeps it under the rug, and it goes out, which even a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old understands that that's an image of a kind of death. And I was transfixed by this. Exactly, I can tell you that that's the moment when it fixed itself in my brain. The whole place stopped. I couldn't understand why the people in the rest of the arena weren't completely stunned. That was almost as astonishing to me as the event itself. Now later on, this is an afterthought, an afterword, apparently he appeared on the Carol Burnett show. And he transformed that image, and it's staggering. She had a character of a kind of a cleaning lady. Okay, you know. Okay. And he swept up the light, but instead of sweeping it under the rug, he picked it up. He picked up the light in his hands and gave it to her. And she took it and put it in her pocket. And it went on. And that's exactly the opposite of the original image. That's an image of life and fertility. And I mean, it's just so amazing over time, if you wait long enough, how something can transform itself. And I just staggering again, re-staggered.
There could not be a more wonderful conclusion to this panel. Thank you so much, Robert, Cory, Cécile, Camille. Thank you all very much. Thank you.